The compact Impreza sedan and hatchback are two of the most important vehicles that Subaru sells in the United States. So for 2017, they redesigned the entire vehicle. In this video, we'll be talking about the 2017 and the 2018 Imprezas because the only real difference for 2018 is a very slight price increase because, again, this is an all-new vehicle for 2017. Not only does this car get an all-new and more premium interior, they've also touched every aspect of the car. Thanks to an all-new suspension design and a body that is 70% more rigid than the outgoing model, handling has dramatically improved. And that's a good thing, because what we're seeing here is going to be the basis for all of the new Subaru models that we'll be seeing in the US in the coming few years. In addition to that, Subaru has moved production for all Impreza models sold in the United States to their Indiana plant, so they'll all be made in the US as well. When redesigning the Impreza, Subaru decided to keep the design language very similar to the outgoing model, so this is instantly recognizable as a Subaru up front. On either side of the star logo, we have sort of chrome wings inside this grille, and our model has halogen headlamps. LED headlamps are available in the top-end limited trim. When you move around to the side of the Impreza, you'll notice something different between this and a Corolla and a Civic. We have a much longer hood in terms of the overall proportion of the body. Much like the average European luxury sedan, the engine placement in this vehicle is more similar to what we find in rear-wheel drive vehicles. It is placed long ways in the vehicle, not across the front. In the past, that has meant that some Subaru models have less interior room for the exterior size of the vehicle. But the 2017 and 2018 Impreza really improve on that, and we actually have class-leading interior room, even though this has that long hood profile. The sedan version of the Impreza comes in at 182 inches long, meaning it's just about the same size as a Honda Civic. Definitely longer than something like a Hyundai Elantra. But the hatchback version that we're taking a look at right here falls sort of in the middle of this segment at 175.6 inches long. That puts this right about the same size as a Mazda 3, notably shorter than the Honda Civic. The Honda Civic in hatchback form is unusually long for this segment, mainly because it has more of a liftback profile. So even though the rear glass that we find in this model is raked forward, it's definitely more raked forward in the Honda Civic. And they had to make that vehicle even longer in order to give it the same kind of room that we'd expect in a hatchback. The important thing to remember is that, like most hatchback and sedan pairs, the amount of interior room, especially legroom, is identical between the sedan and the hatchback. Headroom does tend to change just a little bit because of the squarer profile that we find in most hatches, but legroom, seats, etc., they're all going to be very much the same. Out back, we have an all-new tail lamp design that has these sort of C-shapes on each side of the vehicle, and they wrap from the body on over to the tailgate lid. The styling of the Impreza sedan is fairly similar to the Impreza hatch. I'll post a picture right here so you can see what that one looks like. There's a single exhaust tip over there on the passenger side of the vehicle that is fairly well hidden. And of course, we have an all-wheel drive badge over here on the driver's side because, like all Subaru models except for the BRZ, this comes with all-wheel drive standard. As I said before, the drivetrain in the Impreza is very different than every other mainstream compact in the US because this uses a 4-cylinder horizontally opposed boxer-style engine. That means that instead of the cylinders being lined up in a neat little row, one right after the other, like we find in the Corolla or the Honda Civic or a Nissan Sentra, these cylinders are in 2 banks of 2 on each side of the vehicle. And they interact with one another sort of like this. That's why they call it a boxer engine. Now obviously this motion is not meant to be functionally accurate, as some people have pointed out. There is a crankshaft in the middle, and actually the cylinders are sort of firing opposite of one another, but my arms don't really bend that way, so that's the easiest way to describe this. There's a great deal of debate about boxer engines versus inline engines. Boxer engines tend to be a little bit heavier than the average inline engine, but they do drive that weight a little bit lower in the vehicle because they're relatively flat and a little bit closer to the ground. The other advantage to a boxer-style engine is overall engine length, because the engine and transmission are arranged in this vehicle very much like the Audi Quattro system that we find in the A4, A5, A6, etc. The engine is up front, and then behind that we have a longitudinal transmission with the all-wheel drive system integrated into the transmission case. And there is no transfer case and separate front differential case. Everything is jammed right inside that transmission module. That means that if Subaru were to use an inline engine, the hood would have to be an awful lot longer in order to accommodate an engine that would be almost twice as long. At the moment, there is just one engine under this hood for the United States. It's this 2-liter model, and it produces 152 horsepower and 145 pound-feet of torque. It is mated to your choice of a 5-speed manual transmission in the base models, or a continuously variable transmission that you'll find standard in the upper level trims. Taking a closer look at the engine, you can really see how wide this is. The front cam cover extends just beyond that oil filler nozzle all the way over here to the other side of the vehicle where the front cam cover ends right about here. But the engine is not terribly long. The front of the engine is just about here, the rest is pulleys and accessory belts, and it really just goes to right about here. I get asked about this frequently, but no, this all-wheel drive system does not share any parts with Audi's Quattro system, even though they do share some similar design elements. The all-wheel drive system in most modern Subarus, like the one that we're driving right here, sends 60% of the power to the front wheels under most circumstances, about 40% to the rear, but it can bias it a little bit stronger to the front if it needs to, or it could lock a center coupling and send all the power to the rear wheels if the front wheels were slipping. If no wheels are slipping, power is split 50-50. That's a little bit different than some of Subaru's previous all-wheel drive systems, which could have a slight rear power bias if they needed to. This particular system, for fuel economy's sake, is going to try and send most of the power to the front. Front seat comfort comes in at 7 out of 10 for most models. That's because we don't find a power seat until we get to that top-end limited trim. We don't have adjustable lumbar support either, although we do have a tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion. That's not too surprising, of course, because we do get standard all-wheel drive in every Impreza model, and the cost of that all-wheel drive system has to come from somewhere. Subaru has been working extremely hard to reduce the cost of their all-wheel drive system so they can give you a vehicle with very few compromises. But I think that the lack of a power seat, especially in mid-level trims, is still one of the compromises that we do see in this cabin. Now that said, this seat is still comfortable for my 6-foot frame, although I could wish for a little bit more lumbar support. It's just not as adjustable as we find in mid-level trims of the competition. So if you're much taller or much shorter than me, you may have a little bit more difficulty finding an ideal driving position in this vehicle than in some of those competitors. But we do again get that standard all-wheel drive system. If you want a more adjustable seat, you can step on up to that limited trim and of course get the power driver's seat. Moving to the rear seats, that score jumps up to 10 out of 10 points because we have a very generous amount of room in the Impreza. 79.6 inches of combined legroom, and that is front row plus second row, puts this towards the top of the category. It's really noticeable if I sit here behind myself where I have about 4.5 inches of legroom left. In addition to that, we also have a very generous 37.1 inches of headroom, even though we do have the model with the optional sunroof. That means that even if I sit very upright in this back seat, my hair is not touching the ceiling. The difference is very noticeable when you compare this to entries that have a very sloping rear roof line. It makes it much harder to sit comfortably in the back seat. If I move over to the middle seat, I still have a generous amount of headroom. My head is again not touching the ceiling, my hair is not brushing the ceiling, although we do have a slightly larger hump than we find in the average entry, of course because that drive shaft to the rear axle has to go somewhere. Moving all the way over to the right side, this front seat is all the way back in its tracks. I still have about 1 inch of legroom left. In kind of an unusual move, the shoulder belt for the center seat position does not come out of the ceiling or the seat back itself. It actually comes out of the side of the vehicle over there on the passenger side. However, there is a little bracket on the center headrest to help center it in the seat. Cargo capacity is obviously the big reason that you'd buy the Impreza hatchback over the Impreza sedan. We get 20.8 cubic feet of storage back here, which is enough to fit 4 24-inch roller bags, and that drops down to 12.3 if you get the sedan. Cargo capacity is one of the areas that we see a little bit of compromise in the Impreza versus some of the other entries in this segment. And that's likely to do with the overall design of the vehicle, especially that boxer engine up front. Because you will find about 25% more cargo room in a Honda Civic hatchback versus the Impreza hatchback, or in something like a Nissan Sentra sedan versus the Impreza sedan. Lifting up the cargo load floor, we find a compact spare tire and the jack right there, but there's really no additional storage. From back here, you can see what I mean about the shoulder belt coming out of the side of the vehicle and then being redirected by this bracket that's attached to the center passenger's headrest. This may look unusual, but it does result in the shoulder belt being better aligned than other compact vehicles where the shoulder belt comes out of the ceiling. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in sort of a mid-level trim, although we do have the optional moonroof. This model has fabric upholstery with 4-way ratchet-style headrests and height-adjustable seatbelts for the driver and the front passenger. The front doors are made from a combination of materials. We have hard plastics lower on the door right there around the speaker grille and that bottle holder. Then we have a soft-touch armrest right there. There's also a soft-touch injection-molded sill for the door and then a fabric panel between the sill and the armrest. The trim that we see on the doors and the dashboard is this imitation carbon fiber. As we see in other Subaru models, the center of the dashboard houses a pod where we find the thermometer, the clock, and of course some of the readouts for our trip computer. If you get one of the top trims of Impreza, then that display is replaced by a full-color LCD. Below that, we find a standard 6.5-inch LCD infotainment system that now features Apple CarPlay and Android Auto standard. In addition to that, we have some vehicle-integrated apps like Pandora and Aha. As with other vehicles that feature standard smartphone integration, this essentially means that all Impreza models come standard with factory navigation if you have an attached smartphone. This display is not as large as the optional displays that we find in some of the competition, but it is fairly large for a standard display. Beneath that, we have a power volume knob, a tune scroll knob, and then we can press and hold it in order to get the sound adjustments for the system. There's a direct access button for apps, phone, radio, and media. Below the infotainment system, we find the controls for the manual single-zone climate control system and a storage cubby where you can very easily put large smartphones. Behind that, we find a fairly traditional console shifter. Drive is all the way down towards the driver, manual mode over to the left, and then you shift with the paddles on the back of the steering wheel. Between the front seats, we find a traditional handbrake, the controls for the heated seats, 2 large cup holders, and then a storage compartment, which opens with a little lever over there on the side, and that's where we find the USB input, auxiliary input, and a 12-volt power port, in addition to a small storage cubby where you can put wallets, keys, that sort of thing. On the driver's side, we have an easy-to-read instrument cluster with a large speedometer and large tachometer. The fuel gauge is digital inside this multifunction display, and there's no engine temperature readout. We simply get a light for hot or cold. The steering wheel is a 3-spoke design. It's urethane in this particular model with sport grips up top. The left side of the wheel is where you're going to find infotainment controls, track, forward, backward, volume, up, down. There's an info button that cycles through the information in the center display above the infotainment system, source selection, phone hang-up, pickup, and voice command, and then these toggles down here control the multifunction display between the speedometer and the tachometer. The right side of the wheel is where we find the controls for the adaptive cruise control system. This uses the twin camera system that's above the rearview mirror. The new Impreza gets Subaru's latest EyeSight system, which uses 2 cameras, one over here on the left side and one over here on the right side. This module has shrunk considerably since EyeSight first launched in the United States. The cameras look at the road ahead, and it uses both cameras to give the vehicle depth perception, very much like humans have. The system crunches those images together and determines how far it is from the vehicle in front of you, allowing that adaptive cruise control functionality or the autonomous braking and collision warning system. It'll also read the lane lines and give you lane departure warning information, which you can enable or disable with this button right here. You can also turn off the collision warning with this button over here on the right. The SOS and I buttons are part of Subaru's integrated telematics system. Because of the curb weight, the standard all-wheel drive system, and the amount of power we have underneath the hood, this model takes 9 seconds to go from 0 to 60. That is on the slow end for the compact sedan or compact hatchback category. Something like a turbocharged Honda Civic will do it in 6.6. That's on the very fast end of the mainstream entries. This is right about the same as a Nissan Sentra, but most versions of the Mazda 3 or even the Toyota Corolla will do it faster. One of the big changes for the new generation of Impreza is the way that they have decided to tune the continuously variable transmission under the hood. They've really made this imitate a 7-speed automatic transmission under most driving circumstances. Unless you're driving this car very gently out on the road or you're maintaining a specific speed up a hill, it's going to feel more like a stepped automatic. Subaru tells us that that's because most drivers seem to prefer that more typical automatic transmission feel, but it actually means the transmission is being a little bit less efficient both in acceleration and fuel economy than it could otherwise be. In our braking test, we ran from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 124 feet, which is good for this segment. Keep in mind we are not driving the top-end trim, which does get wider tires and therefore stops a little bit shorter. One of the main focuses that Subaru had when designing this generation of the Impreza was improving the handling, and that is definitely noticeable out on the road. The previous generation Impreza was sort of at the bottom of the pack when it came to overall handling ability and overall handling feel. Handling feel is probably the biggest difference between this and the previous generation. They've really quickened up the steering, meaning that it takes fewer turns to have the vehicle turn the same amount on the road, and that definitely helps improve the feel. They've also spent a great deal of time working on the suspension tuning of this vehicle, helping to reduce body roll, reduce tip and dive, and improve lateral grip. That now puts the Impreza above entries like the Toyota Corolla or the Nissan Sentra, but it's still below the Honda Civic or the Mazda 3. And that's because the mission of the Impreza is a little bit different than the Civic or the Mazda. Those two vehicles are very on-road focused, very performance focused, trying to give you the best handling in the corners, etc. And with the Subaru Impreza, Subaru definitely has a focus for situations where the road is not as smoothly paved. So if you live down a gravel road or down a rough road, or you like taking your vehicle camping out on less improved road surfaces, this is going to have a suspension that is more targeted towards that use case. And that's logically why Subaru seem to be so popular in places like Maine or in Colorado or in the Pacific Northwest. However, because grip is definitely below some of those mainstream entries in this segment, I'm going to have to give handling a B. Over the years, we've come to associate most Subaru models with an excellent highway ride or an excellent ride out on rougher roads like we're on right here. That's all down to the suspension design, because in general, Subarus seem to be designed for rougher road situations than the average compact vehicle. And that's definitely noticeable when we start driving out on gravel roads or rough roads or rutted roads. Even though we don't really have that much more ground clearance in the regular Impreza model, the way the suspension, especially the springs, have been tuned means that this is going to be a little bit more comfortable. Now in the past, that has meant that we've had a lot more body roll, an awful lot more tip and dive in Subaru models than in the competition. But as I said earlier, in this generation of the Impreza, that's something the engineers have really worked on. We still have more body roll, more tip and dive than you find in something like a Honda Civic or a Mazda 3, but the trade-off for that is a more compliant ride when you're on rougher surfaces. The softer suspension design definitely pays dividends back out here on a paved road, where I'm going to give the ride an A. In our cabin noise test, we scored 73.5 decibels at 50 miles an hour, which means this is a little bit quieter than the Impreza was in the past, but cabin noise is still a little bit higher than some of the quiet entries. Cabin noise is an area where we have seen sort of classic compromise between giving us the standard all-wheel drive system and adding extra sound insulation. In addition, the boxer engine design we find under the hood is a little bit louder than the average engine in this segment. All-wheel drive always has a negative impact on fuel economy, regardless of the vehicle that system is in, or the system that we're talking about. Because all-wheel drive systems add extra friction, they add extra weight, they add extra complexity to the vehicle. Subaru seems to be more dedicated at trying to improve fuel economy in their all-wheel drive vehicles than most other car companies, likely because all-wheel drive is standard on all Subaru models. And that means that if you're comparing fuel economy and performance and traction, etc., in a base Subaru vehicle to a base competitive vehicle, this is going to have all-wheel drive, the other one's not, but you're going to be staring at that fuel economy number right there on the window sticker. And Subaru really has done an impressive job with their latest vehicles, because we have been averaging about 34 miles per gallon over a week of very mixed driving in this car. That's better than the EPA says we should be getting, so I'm definitely going to give this an A+. Obviously, there is a bit of a performance trade-off for this high fuel economy, because you will get similar fuel economy and much better performance in certain versions of Honda Civic, but it's not going to be all-wheel drive, and this is very impressive for a vehicle that has an all-wheel drive system, especially an all-wheel drive system that is always trying to send some of the power to the rear axle. This all-wheel drive system feels much more sure-footed on loose surfaces like grass or like sand or snow or icy surfaces or just an average slippery wet road than many of those part-time all-wheel drive systems that have to do a lot of slipping before they engage. Now, some slip is definitely required in this system before it sends more power to the rear axle than about the 40% that it usually sends, but it is still going to feel more sure-footed than most of those other all-wheel drive systems out there. And that's really what Subaru has long been known for. The new Impreza starts at $18,495 for the base 2.I sedan model. For that model, you get the 5-speed manual transmission, but you do get standard all-wheel drive, and that really is what makes the Impreza unique in this segment. The other thing that makes the Impreza very unique is that we can get the hatchback in that base trim, and the hatchback premium is only $500. This is one of the smallest upsells in order to turn your sedan into a hatchback that we see in America. It's also worth noting that all Impreza models now get standard Apple CarPlay and Android Auto and the 6.5-inch infotainment system that we've been looking at today. If you get the top-end trims, then we do get a larger 8-inch screen that is one of the larger ones that we see in this compact sedan and compact hatchback segment. As you look at the chart in front of you, it's worth noting that all models of the Impreza use the same tire width, which is a 205 width tire, pretty standard in the compact sedan and compact hatchback segment, except for the Sport model. The Sport model does get 225 width tires, because of the very small price increase from going to the sedan to the hatchback, and the fact that the hatchback gives you almost double the cargo room and more headroom while not cutting back on any legroom, I would say unless you really dislike the way hatchbacks look, you should get the Impreza hatchback over the Impreza sedan. According to the EPA, fuel economy should drop by 1 mile per gallon if you get the hatchback, but in our real-world tests, they're essentially the same. Obviously, there's no free lunch. By giving us the standard all-wheel drive system, we do find fewer features in the Impreza than we find in some of the competition. However, Subaru has been incredibly aggressive at trying to minimize this, and as a result, the base Impreza does end up being one of the best values in the compact sedan segment. It may not have the lowest base price, but its base price is very competitive with the two-wheel drive competition. Of course, there are still a few compromises. You won't find two-zone automatic climate control until the very top-end trim. There's no standard auto braking system that we find in some of the competitors, no standard radar adaptive cruise control like we find in the Toyota Corolla. On the other hand, if you're looking for one of the least expensive all-wheel drive vehicles in America, the Subaru Impreza is definitely one of them. It also, as I said, is an excellent value. That moves us along to our pros and cons. Obviously, standard all-wheel drive is a definite pro for the Impreza. An inexpensive hatch upgrade is also a strong selling point. Some of the manufacturers out there have a multi-$1,000 delta between the cost of the hatchback and the cost of their base sedan. We also get Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and that really helps my impression of the infotainment system in the Subaru. Because I'm not a huge fan of the Subaru's interface in terms of general aesthetics or in terms of its easy-to-use functionality, but Apple CarPlay and Android Auto really solves that problem. And it's also a major selling point when you compare this to entries like the Sentra or the Corolla, which do not have that kind of smartphone integration. It also means that every version of the Impreza will have factory navigation as long as you have a smartphone with you. On the downside, standard content is skewed towards that all-wheel drive system, so we don't have a standard automatic transmission, standard two-zone climate control, or some of the other creature comforts that we do find in some of the competitors. And overall, the Impreza is still not as refined as something like the Honda Civic. The Civic does come across as a very mature, very refined vehicle, and the Impreza, you can tell that a few corners have to be cut in order to give us the strong value, the standard all-wheel drive, and those other standard features that we find in the cabin. Speaking of the Civic, let's dive into that model. The Civic starts at $18,740. If you want the hatchback, that's $19,700. Now the hatchback I think is a slightly better deal than the Civic sedan because we do get the turbocharged engine standard in the Civic hatch. However, it's still going to cost you more than a base Impreza hatch, and you won't get all-wheel drive. The Civic comes across as the most premium and the most sporty entry in this group. The interior is very well put together both in terms of overall design and materials quality, and it has one of the best suspensions that we find in this group. Handling is absolutely incredible in the sport versions of the hatch, and that's even before we talk about the Civic Si or the Civic Type R. You can think of the Honda Civic Coupe as sort of a combination of the Ford Focus ST and the Ford Focus RS, and some of the best features that we find in other entries in this segment, and sort of discount Acura all jammed into the same vehicle. On the downside, the extra refinement and the handling ability we see in the Civic will cost you because it's going to be notably more expensive than a comparably equipped Subaru. Next up, we have the Toyota Corolla. It starts at $18,500, $18,750 if you want the Corolla IM hatchback. On the surface, it seems that the Corolla to Corolla IM hatchback is the smallest delta between sedan and hatch in this segment. However, it's not really the case because we don't find all the same features in the base Corolla IM that we do find in the base Corolla. The reason for that is that the Corolla and the Corolla IM are almost but not quite the same vehicle. I actually think the Corolla IM is the better value. The IM is also the better handling option because the IM uses a fully independent double wishbone rear suspension, which is very, very rare in the compact sedan segment or compact hatchback segment, while the standard Corolla sedan uses a non-independent suspension. The Corolla IM started its life as the Scion IM, and Toyota decided that when they put it under the Toyota brand, that they would keep the models and the trims that they had before. That means that it's sold only two ways. One with manual transmission and one with an automatic transmission. There are no options to choose from. That means if you want some of the higher end features in that Corolla IM, you just won't find them. It's also worth noting that the Corolla sedan has standard adaptive cruise control with autonomous braking, whereas the Corolla IM only gets the autonomous braking portion. We don't get the adaptive cruise control functionality. Next up, we have the Nissan Sentra. At $16,990, it is one of the best-selling compact vehicles in America, but there is no hatchback version of the Sentra. The closest corollary to a Sentra hatchback would probably be the Nissan Rogue Sport, but it's not really the same kind of thing. So for this section, we're really just talking about the Sentra. The Sentra has one of the lowest base prices of any vehicle in this category. Of course, you aren't going to find many features and functions in that base model, but it does drive the acquisition cost down very low. The Sentra delivers excellent fuel economy, an enormous trunk, and a huge back seat. There is also the Sentra SR, which gives us a little bit more power and a little bit sportier handling, but it's not quite up to the same standard as we find out of the Civic Sport trims. You of course won't find all-wheel drive in the Sentra model, but as far as value goes, it compares very well to the Impreza because of that low base price. Like the Impreza, the Chevy Cruze comes as either a sedan or a hatchback, but there's a pretty big price difference between the two. The Cruze starts at $16,975, the hatchback starts at $21,240. The reason for that is primarily because there is no base trim of the Chevy Cruze hatch. But when you comparably equip the sedan and the hatchback, the price difference between the two is going to be larger than we see in the Subaru. The Cruze is a very well-rounded vehicle, but it doesn't really have many features that really differentiate itself from the crowd. The caveat for that, of course, would be the actual transaction cost, because generally the Chevy Cruze should sell at a greater discount versus MSRP than some of the other entries in this group. The Subaru especially tends to sell very close to its MSRP, whereas we see more cash on the hood of the Chevy Cruze. At this point in time, the Honda Civic remains my top pick in this category, whether we're looking at the sedan or the hatchback. But my caveat here would be as long as you can afford it, because the Honda Civic, again, is going to be one of the more expensive options, especially when you factor in comparable equipment. Acceleration, handling, and interior refinement are definitely tops in this segment for the Civic. Honda also allows you to put their latest active safety systems in most trims of that car. If you're looking for the best value in this segment, I would say it's a tie between the Subaru Impreza and the Corolla IM. The Corolla really does handle very well for this segment thanks to its independent rear suspension, the wide standard tires that we find in that model, and the overall design of that car. Because Toyota makes only two different trims, the one with the automatic transmission or the one with the manual transmission, they've jammed an awful lot of standard feature content in that base model as well. On the downside, again, if you want more features and functions than you'll find in that Corolla IM, you'll have to go elsewhere because it only comes one way. The Subaru impresses when it comes to fuel economy, the standard all-wheel drive system, and overall vehicle value. Subaru has also worked very hard with this latest version of the Impreza to try and fix some of the things that people complained about in prior generations. They've reduced the amount of cabin noise that we find, they've improved the interior refinement, although it does still drop below some of the competition, and they've also worked very hard to make sure that all-wheel drive fuel economy is very competitive with the front-wheel drive entries. And lastly, of course, if you're simply looking for one of the least expensive all-wheel drive vehicles in America, definitely put the Impreza on your shopping list. Thanks for checking out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes. Be sure and find us over at facebook.com/AlexOnAutos, where you can see what we're driving today. And then head on over to patreon.com so you can support this channel. I'll see you next week.